All right, yeah, thanks everyone for coming, and thanks DeepSec for having me. Today, I'm going to talk about TLS 1.3, and specifically what's changed in TLS 1.3 versus previous versions of the protocol, security-wise and otherwise, and Cloudflare's experience with deploying it. So, let's start with the past. Transport layer security. Just as a brief overview, what is it? This is a point-to-point secure communication protocol. This is something that is used for two parties to communicate securely. And by securely, I mean encrypted and authenticated. And the typical model for TLS is that it's one-way authenticated. The server authenticates to the client, usually with an X509-based PKI authentication scheme. There's also optional client authentication. And if you think of this in terms of the OSI model, TLS sits right here in layer 6, right under HTTP. So in the OSI model, layer 6 and 5 are sort of ambiguous, not necessarily always used by implementations, but on the web stack, it kind of goes like this: HTTP, TLS, TCP, IP. And since we're in Austria, I thought I'd change the cake up a little bit. But yeah, we're still right there in layer 6. And TLS really does provide this secure pipe for other protocols to go through. And HTTP is a very common one, SMTP, if you think of Start TLS, and server-to-server communication, gRPC. This is HTTP2 over TLS. And these aren't the only applications, but it's something that can be used as a tool to bolt on security or to layer security below the layer 7 application. And this is not just an important protocol, it's fundamental to security. And not just security of the web, but the entire internet. Chrome recently announced, and this is Firefox's telemetry actually, that over 50% of page loads on the internet are now HTTPS. So this is protecting a whole load, the majority of communications when browsing the internet. So TLS hasn't always been TLS. There's been an evolution over time, and it's gained some features, lost some features, changed in various ways. And it sort of started back in the 90s, and I think it might have been 1993, but there's this thing called SSLv1 that I wasn't able to get a spec for, but from what I'm told, it's, you know, pile of poo. SSLv2, this is what was introduced with Netscape Navigator in 1994, and it's been known to have several security vulnerabilities. More recently, in the talk yesterday, supporting SSLv2 enables the drown attack. Among other things, it's not very secure. SSLv3, this was a total rewrite of SSLv2 by Paul Coker and others in 1995, and this was shown to be very recently, vulnerable to an attack called Poodle, though it's been used for a while, and it only recently lost all sorts of implementations or lost support in servers for the most part, and clients because of Poodle. The IETF took over SSL, or it was Secure Sockets Layer is what Netscape called it, and renamed it TLS, confusingly, and started at version 1.0, and this was eventually standardized in 1999. And since then, it's been found there's one attack that was found to work against TLS 1.0, and there's been quite a few. But the major first attack was Beast, and that kind of inspired, or the precursors to Beast inspired TLS 1.1, which was 7 years later in 2006. And almost all implementations of TLS 1.1 were found to be vulnerable to all sorts of different types of attacks. Lucky 13, which was a padding oracle on CBC cipher suites with Mac and Encrypt. RC4, which was the only available cipher suite that was a stream cipher, was shown to have biases, and you could actually strip HTTPS connections with that. Even if you do use encrypted MAC, there's the idea of if your cipher has a small enough block size, you can have birthday collisions. This is a paper that was published this year called Suite 32. TLS 1.2 was published in 2008, and this is kind of the gold standard. It's up to around 60 to 80% of web connections are TLS 1.2. I think it's around 80% at this time. And this is known to be safe with the right configuration. And that's an important point, because there's a lot of wrong configurations for TLS 1.2 that can end up leaving it insecure. So what are the pieces? Let's just break down what makes up TLS. And it's really three things: a key exchange, authentication, and then a bulk encryption of data. And the key exchange and authentication, this is a handshake. So essentially, the client and server exchange messages, and this handshake that's shown here is the Diffie-Hellman-based handshake. Essentially, the client and server both share a Diffie-Hellman key share, and the server provides a certificate, and the certificate is used to validate the signature of all the previous messages. Ooh, I'm starting to get very echoey here. Okay.
Yeah.
So here are the pieces. It's really 2 round trips before the request and the actual data can go through. And there's a key exchange and an authentication. I'll get into more detail what that means. So what's in a hello? Other than the crypto pieces, what's in a hello? Well, one of the major pieces is exchanging a cipher suite. And a cipher suite is just this. It's the list of, it's a concatenation of the 3 types of pieces that you need: a key exchange, authentication type, and a cipher. So for example, here's one that's elliptic curve, Diffie-Hellman, ephemeral, with RSA authentication, and the cipher is AES 256 GCM SHA 384. And there's different types for all of these, and they sort of common in TLS 1.2 and earlier. They combine together to form a cipher suite. So you can just swap out all sorts of different types for these. This is sort of one of the more secure cipher suites in TLS 1.2. But the way the exchange goes is the client provides the server a list in ordered preference of cipher suites. The server itself has a list of cipher suites that it supports, and then the server will support the highest in the server preference of the one supported by the client. So if you consider this cipher suite 1, 2, 3, and 3 is preferred by the server's going to pick 3. And then that's going to decide what key exchange, which authentication, and which cipher is used. Now, in TLS 1.2, there's really 3 types of key exchange. You have your static RSA. This is the classic form. This is what was introduced back in SSL v2. And in order to exchange data in this form, there's something called a pre-master secret. The client generates this, encrypts it with the server's public key, and sends it to the server. And this pre-master secret is used in combination with a server random and a client random to generate a master secret, and that's used to derive session keys. This pre-master secret derivation to go from pre-master secret to master secret to session key is the same. And if you look here, this SHA-384, this is a hash function that's used in that derivation of going from one key to the next. So that's static RSA. It's sort of created by the client and sent in the clear to the server. Well, it's encrypted with the public key of the server cert, but it's sent in the clear. In Diffie-Hellman, both the client and the server contribute Diffie-Hellman key shares. G to the A, G to the B. G to the AB becomes your pre-master secret. You derive the master secret from that and go forward. ECDHE is Diffie-Hellman with elliptic curves. It's very close to the same algorithm, but instead of using numbers exponentiated and modulo a prime, you have elliptic curve points that you can multiply together, and they form a group, and you can do Diffie-Hellman with that. And typically, these three can be used safely, but with static RSA, there's an idea that there's no forward secrecy. So your pre-master secret is tied directly to the certificate's private key. So if someone manages to obtain the private key of the certificate, even if it's expired, they can retroactively go and decrypt entire conversations. So this is considered a bad thing, forward secrecy, but in the past, there's some advantages to static RSA from a computational perspective, but nowadays with the type of computers and processing power we have, this trade-off is sort of no longer worth it. With Diffie-Hellman, it's easy to make a mistake in TLS 1.2 because the server gets to choose which Diffie-Hellman group is being used, and a lot of implementations have done that incorrectly. And not only that, well, Diffie-Hellman depends on the fact that the group is of a specific order, and that your space that you're doing your exponentiation on is actually a very big space, so that you can't do the reverse of the finite field arithmetic. And there's nothing built into the protocol right now to actually prevent you from using a backdoored Diffie-Hellman, something that allows it so that it looks safe, but it actually isn't. Elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, this is fine. I mean, it's pretty much the gold standard, except that you have to use a curve that is considered safe. And in the early days of TLS, there were a wide variety of different curves that you could use, and some of them are, by modern standards, considered small or considered to potentially have structural faults that make them less than ideal for computation. Not that there's attacks, but that there could potentially be attacks in the future. So that's your key exchange in TLS. The next step is authentication. Authentication is required to do key exchange, or to do Diffie-Hellman key exchange. Diffie-Hellman without authentication is something that you can man in the middle very easily. So these two things are very closely tied together. In TLS 1.2, this is done with a certificate. And there are really two widely deployed types of certificates that are trusted, at least in the web PKI, and that's RSA and elliptic curve discrete signature algorithm. So there's elliptic curve ones and there's RSA. Typically the ECDSA ones are only of two types of curves, two NIST curves, P256 and P384. And essentially what you do in authentication is you use the private key of the certificate to do a signature. And with RSA, it's an algorithm called PKCS1 1.5, which is known to be somewhat fragile in terms of you can use it to do certain types of oracle attacks. It's not known to be directly insecure in TLS, but it is not a very solid construction for digital signatures. And there's another one, RSA PSS, which would be better. When it comes to ECDSA, there's a requirement that every signature that you do, you need to have some very good random data to scramble up the equation. And it's to the point where if you reuse the same data or you have predictable data for this random nonce, that you can actually recover the secret key from just signatures. So this is also a little bit of a dangerous algorithm to use. There have been some examples in the past, such as on Android, where because the random number generation was deterministic, or at a certain percentage of time would return the same value, that people were able to steal ECDSA keys. Another piece is when you're doing a signature, it typically involves both a hash and then a public key operation on that hash. And which hash you use can actually determine different sort of things. So if you use an MD5 or some sort of hash function that is known to have a collision, then there are attacks. There was a paper, I believe last year, called Sloth, which took advantage of the fact that if there's an MD5 or some sort of collision, some sort of non-collision resistant hash function used, in your transcript that you can actually manipulate a conversation and change the handshake. So what do you sign in TLS 1.2? Essentially, you sign these two clients: client random, server random, and the public key itself. And this is something that resulted in quite a few issues. Specifically, a series of papers starting with Freak, Logjam, and there are some other types of attacks. But basically, the entire handshake transcript is not signed in the default TLS. So you're only signing the pieces that are used to derive the master secret. So if you can actually manipulate the cipher suites to choose very old legacy cipher suites, for example, there were some export cipher suites that were very, very low bit length. If you could be a man in the middle and swap out the cipher suite for something weak, then you could actually break the handshake and make it seem like the client is connecting to a valid server, the server is connecting to a valid client. They just happen to use weak ciphers, and because this cipher negotiation is not signed, then there's no way for you to actually validate this. So there's an idea called the extended master secret, which was introduced to help solve this, where rather than the master secret being a pre-master secret and then the two random values, it's derived from the pre-master secret and the hash of the entire conversation. So if someone is going to be swapping out these ciphers and trying to downgrade your handshake, then you're not going to end up with the same key. This really helps a bunch of things, including the triple handshake attack. So that's authentication. The third part is encryption or encipherment. This is what the tube is in TLS 1.2. So as you send data in, you get encrypted data, send it across the wire. There's a couple modes in TLS 1.2. There's CBC mode ciphers, cipher block chaining, where if you have a block cipher, you basically XOR the result of one block into the input of the next block and go all the way down. And the way this was framed in TLS 1.0 resulted in some manipulation you could do regarding the initialization vectors, and this caused the beast vulnerability. The fact that so encipherment in the case of TLS is not just encryption, it's encryption and authentication, so message authentication. So if you have a mode like CBC mode ciphers, you have to have a MAC as well, a message authentication code. And that can either go before the encryption or after the encryption. If it goes before the encryption, you have to have the right padding so that it actually fits into the size of the cipher block. And if you don't do that correctly, you're going to get a bunch of problems. And by correctly, I mean in constant time. So Lucky 13, Poodle, these are a bunch of attacks that actually take advantage of an incorrect MAC then encrypt implementation. Suite 32, as I mentioned, is what happens if you use triple DES, which has a small block size, and you can end up having collisions of blocks at a certain percentage because of the birthday attack, somewhere about 32 gigabytes of data. You're going to get a collision, and as an attacker, if you can manipulate some things in HTTPS, you can. Then you can cause this thing to collide. So CBC mode ciphers are pretty risky, although it seemed to be a very solid choice at the time. There's only one stream cipher in TLS, and that's RC4, which has been shown to be predictable to a certain extent. And there's also a lot of evidence that as much as it's broken right now in the public, that in certain private locations, it's much more broken than it is publicly. So in TLS 1.2, there's this concept of an AEAD that was introduced, which is it's essentially not doing encryption then MAC or MAC then encryption. You do them both together in the same construct. And AES GCM and Cha Poly are examples of this. One issue with AEADs is that you have a nonce, and if this gets reused, it's kind of catastrophic for the construction. So make sure that you don't reuse the same nonce. In TLS 1.2, it's possible to do that. TLS 1.3, I'll get to it. Okay, so we covered the three major points of what TLS is. It's authentication, key exchange, encipherment. There's another construct that people added called session resumption, which allows you to take an existing session and without having to do the full 2 back and forths, you can resume a new session. And the way this works is sort of like a database problem. It's you take your session and you encrypt it on the server side with the session ticket key, and then you just embed that in the handshake. So if somebody on the client side, they get to store this blob that encapsulates all the keys, they send it back to the server, and then the server can resume that connection without actually needing to hold state other than the key. But the session ticket key, because it's a long-term secret that the server needs to keep, and if someone were to extract that session ticket key, then they can take a transcript and actually decrypt any following conversations. So this is a pretty big risk to forward secrecy as well, sort of similar to the way the RSA key exchange is. So I mentioned there's a safe configuration for TLS 1.2. What's the safe configuration? You use an AEA cipher, use extended master secret, which actually is not implemented yet in OpenSSL 102, so good luck with that. Upgrade to OpenSSL 1.1 for that. ECDHE, so elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, always use a new point per connection, and then restrict resumption or make sure that you limit the length of time for the resumption master secret. And that's the end of the past. That's sort of TLS as it stood or as it stands as publicly. So one of the things that people wanted to do was to fix TLS, and the way they planned to do that, at least at the IETF, was to come up with a new draft of a new version of TLS, and they called it TLS 1.3. Although there's some debate on the mailing list whether it should be called TLS 1. Or TLS 2.0 or not, because it is quite a big change, but it's not backwards incompatible. Currently, this is on the 18th draft, and the first draft, 19 drafts ago, was April 2014. So this has been a pretty long process, and it's still managed to keep the length short, and it's 118 pages versus 104, although I would argue that these 118 pages are a lot more clear, and things are a lot more well-defined. So what are the major goals of TLS 1.3? The first is to just remove all the broken crypto that I mentioned, all the sort of insecure designs and insecure ciphers and insecure combinations of ciphers and pieces that I mentioned that have come up in attacks over the last little while. It should be clear and simple to implement. So TLS 1.2 may have had some ambiguities, maybe more difficult to implement. TLS 1.3 is supposed to be simpler. Another important point is formal verification. This is one of the reasons there were so many attacks against previous versions of TLS, is that the academic community didn't manage to sit down and do a formal implementation until after, or formal verification of the security until after it was widely in use. Backwards compatibility is also an important thing. If you're running a TLS 1.3 enabled browser and server, you should be able to go forward and back, and it shouldn't cause any major issues. And the last piece is kind of the more interesting piece from an implementation perspective if you're not a security person, which is make the handshake faster. So what are the changes? So as I mentioned before, the cipher suites in TLS 1.2 used to be a concatenation of key exchange, authentication, and cipher. These are kind of broken out into 3 separate negotiations in TLS 1.3. So you provide a list of key exchanges, a list of authentications, and a list of ciphers, and these are all negotiated separately. This helps prevent a combinatorial explosion of ciphers in the future. When it comes to key exchange, the options have been cut down severely. So you're allowed to do elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, but there's only a few select curves that you can use for this. There are some new curves that are not elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman, but they're based on Dan Bernstein's curves, 25519, and Michael Hamburg's Goldilocks curve, 448. And these are new key exchange methods that are considered to be pretty safe as well. The IETF at the CFRG is looking into these. And then for finite field Diffie-Hellman, these were chosen to be preset groups. So you can't actually trick the client, or you can't accidentally use a curve that doesn't have the right security in terms of Diffie-Hellman, which was possible in TLS 1.2. So this is actually a much smaller list and a much more restricted list. There's not as much freedom for the server to choose these key exchanges or the client. Authentication, RSA. If you have an RSA certificate, you use RSA PSS, which is just a lot less dangerous to use in terms of signature algorithm. ECDSA is still there, so don't reuse your nonces for ECDSA. And then by default, the entire transcript is signed. So things like freak and logjam, anything to do with downgrading the ciphers. Not that there are any weak ciphers anymore, but downgrading the ciphers is not necessarily possible. Speaking of ciphers, it's AADs only, so no ciphers, no stream ciphers, no CBC mode ciphers, and this really only leaves two types of ciphers, which is AES and GCM mode, which is an AEAD for AES, as well as another DJB curve, sorry, not DJB curve, but DJB crypto piece, which is Cha-Cha 20 Poly 1305. And when it comes to deriving one key from the next to the next, there's no weak types of session transcript hashes. You can't use MD5 or things like this. So this avoids problems like sloth. And this is kind of what it looks like. Well, if you load up your Netscape Navigator with TLS 1.3 support, it looks like this. So you have X25519, AES 128 GCM, TLS 1.3. Now, I mentioned that the handshake is faster, or one of the goals was to make the handshake faster. And as you may recall from the previous slide, it required 2 full back and forths in TLS 1.2. In TLS 1.3, there's only the need for 1 back and forth. So in this case, because the key exchange has been limited in scope in terms of the number of things you could do, the client can actually guess what the server supports for key exchange and send their key share in the first flight. And this creates an optimal exchange in terms of number of flights. So you can go down from 2 full round trips to 1, which is a really big deal for latency. And if, for example, you don't guess, there's this other mode called hello retry request that allows you to fall back to a full two round trip. But we expect most TLS 1.3 implementations to not do that. Session resumption. Session resumption has been somewhat fixed from a forward security perspective. The session ticket keys are limited to 7 days in time, and rather than encrypting all your session keys, you're encrypting something called a resumption master secret, which is a step forward in the hash from the original one. So, building and deploying TLS 1.3. This is not only did we at Cloudflare get involved with the specification, but we decided to build it and deploy it. Our stack looks somewhat like this. We have an OpenSSL with Nginx, and then an instance in front of your website. So we handle the TLS termination, and then we establish a new connection to your origin with TLS. And since OpenSSL wasn't planning on actually building this, and we have some pretty strong expertise in Google's Golang, we decided to build our own TLS 1.3 implementation called TLS Tris. And we didn't want to impact all existing connections, so we didn't want to send everything through this new path. It was really for experimentation. we built this inspection piece that looks at the first 2 bytes of the connection. Strangely enough, TLS 1.2 has version 3.3 on the wire, and TLS 1.3 was 3.4. So if it's the first 2 bytes of 3.4, we shunt it to the new connection versus the old one. And so it kind of looks like this. And so we had a big launch in September, encryption week, and we saw a bunch of connections using TLS 1.3. When we launched, we had draft 14 support. Firefox Nightly Chrome Canary had support for this, so you could turn it on, and a lot of people did, but we only really saw 1 connection per second as we first launched. And draft 14 saw some problems, specifically version intolerance. Using 3.4 actually breaks a bunch of servers, and from Chrome's perspective, they could either do one of 3 things. One is just break these sites so that Chrome doesn't work with a certain percentage of the internet, which was infeasible for their business model. Implement an insecure fallback, so if 1.3 doesn't connect, you fall back to 1.2, or lobby IETF to change negotiation, which is sort of what they did. So version number in draft 16 is actually, this is a typo, it's 3.3. It's the same version as TLS 1.2. It's just that 1.3 is negotiated with an extension. This broke our implementation for a week, but we eventually caught up, and SSL Labs is still kind of broken with that. But in any case, we launched it, and that's it. So what's the future of TRIS? Hopefully we take TLS TRIS, and we're hoping to put this into part of Golang standard library. So that they have TLS implementation in the standard library. We're hoping to upstream this. There's also the NCC group has a cryptography services division. They're going to be doing a full audit of the source code in a month's time or so. What else has happened with TLS 1.3 since the launch? Chrome Canary enabled a field test. So if you're using Chrome Canary, there's a percentage that your chance that TLS 1.3 is enabled. Firefox Nightly, I believe today, or yesterday's Nightly build enabled it by default. So if you're using Nightly, you can browse one of the several million sites that's using Cloudflare that has TLS 1.3 enabled by default. And Firefox is planning on enabling it by default in March. OpenSSL is going to have support, they announced, in 6 months or so. So the draft is at 18 for TLS 1.3. It's been submitted for last call, and we're sort of waiting for the academic cryptographers to come through with some formal analyses before actually finalizing this. So that's not it. There's also a new feature in TLS 1.3. I mentioned speed. People are speed demons. This is the 0 round trip mode. So if you've already established a connection with the server, you can send your request on the very first flight. No need to do 1 back and forth for a connection. And this becomes part of the handshake itself. And that's pretty cool. But it's also, from a security perspective, somewhat dangerous. And the reason for this is that it's inherently replayable. If someone were to, because there's no back and forth, there's no actual negotiation other than at the TCP layer, that someone is who they say they are. So with 0RTT, there's this attack that you can think of where if you take the hello from a real client and then replay it as an attacker to another server that still has the same session ticket key, you can cause this request, if it's not idempotent, to actually influence the behavior on the server. There's protection against this built into the specification, but it's really about a timestamp. So there's a timestamp in this thing that says how long has it been since you got the last communication, and if this is off by a number of seconds or a large amount of time, then the server can say, okay, this is somewhat fishy, but the granularity is very low on determining whether or not this request is still valid or not, or if the clock is very, very slow for the client for some reason, it's not going to work. But just in any case, if you were able to sniff one of these connections and then make another connection to another server, it could potentially, and think of a post request, say like transfer X amount of dollars from this account to the other. And the second request, it would just sort of do that again and again, and you could kind of amplify that. And within a few small time window, you could send thousands of requests that end up doing the same thing. But even if your request in the 0RTT mode is idempotent, it doesn't actually change the state on the server, you can actually figure things out from GET requests, from requests that don't change the state if they're just querying something. So you could just think of, just from a banking example again, you could have a GET request that says, get me the total amount of money in this account. And if it goes up by an order of magnitude, the size of the packet might be different coming back. So you can actually leak information this way. So 0RTT is dangerous, but almost everything else in TLS 1.3 is a large improvement over TLS 1.2. And I'll leave you with this quote from Tim Cook on encryption. Encryption's great, and it's actually a very important part of security for us on the internet, browsing the web, and society in general. And that's it. Thank you very much. So we have time for a few questions. I'm happy to go into detail about any one of these pieces. That this is a big protocol, and I glossed over some details. So if anybody wants to dig in, now's the time.
One question from me. Okay, soon. You mentioned Diffie-Hellman, that it's easy to, if all people are using the same setup, it's easy to break because encryption can be pre-computed. Has there something been done, or?
Yeah, there's a paper that was just published on ePrint by Nadia Henninger, which described how people were mixing up which Diffie-Hellman parameters with DSA parameters. So with the Diffie-Hellman parameter, the ideal parameter you want is something that is a prime number or such that if you divide it by 2 and subtract 1, you still have a prime number. And then that gives you a very large group to deal with. Whereas in DSA, they encourage you to have, so if you have a 1024-bit number, they encourage your subgroup to be small, like 256 bits, and allow you to work over that. So if you end up using a DSA key for Diffie-Hellman, you can end up reducing the security of your system without even knowing about it.
Yeah, so following up on that question, since the standard reduced the possibilities for configurations, it sounds like it sounds like a good thing in isolation, but it also introduces monoculture. So if something breaks, it might be a problem. So what do you think about that?
Yeah, so that's a good question. Simplicity and reduction of choices is what enabled the one round-trip handshake, but it does so potentially result in a smaller set of things you can do. And if one thing in that set breaks, then the entire protocol is maybe in danger. But if you think of, compared to TLS 1.2, we have the same set of options, except in TLS 1.2 you also had this humongous set of insecure options. So if the secure pieces in TLS 1.3 are broken, in TLS 1.2 we were in the same situation. It's just the number of secure options in TLS 1.2 is so small that you might as well just limit it to that. The other thing is that TLS 1.3 does have room to grow in terms of key exchange and all these different things. Different browsers are going to use different configurations. For example, Chrome, I'm told, is going to use X25519 as the default, the only key share for doing key exchange, which is kind of a big break from anything we've done in TLS previously, whereas other browsers are going to continue with elliptic curve Diffie-Hellman. with NIST curves. So hopefully that answers your question.